Hi, I'm Jana with Purl Together, and in this week's video, we're going to talk about block number 2 for the Berroco Mystery Blanket Knit Along. So the first thing you're going to notice is that the gauge is different than block number 1, and so we're going to talk about that. In the first video, I talked about why it's important to make a swatch to double check your gauge so that your squares end up coming out at the 12-inch by 12-inch size that you want them. So when we're done, we can sew them all together and not have to fuss with it too much, right? But you'll notice that this pattern has you suggested the same needle size as block number 1, but the gauge is different. Now, there's several reasons for this. One, it's a different person that designed block number 2 than block number 1. And so they're going to have their own individual tension, right? And gauge, depending on the needle, whether they knit more tightly or more loosely than the person that designed the first block. Secondly, another reason for this is when you look at the pattern, there's a lot more knits and purls that are alternating, knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one. So every time that you bring that yarn back and forth to the front and the back, you're introducing more yarn per stitch. Okay, so that is going to change the tension or change the gauge or the number of stitches per inch that you get. So having said all that, you're using the same yarn. Well, in theory, you're using the same yarn as you did for block 1. It's just a different color. So I went ahead and started knitting it and thought, well, if I'm wrong, I haven't done so much that it would, totally tear me up or destroy me to pull it out, right? So remember in the first video, if you watch that, I knitted a swatch and I measured the gauge of my stitches before I blocked it, before I soaked it and blocked it. So I wrote that down, and I knew that my gauge was 5 1/3 stitches per inch before I got it wet and soaked it. If this ended up being also 5 1/3 before blocking, then I would know that I could still use the same needles that I did for the first block. So I hope that makes sense. So if you want to knit a swatch for block 2, I would highly recommend it. If you're not going to, and you don't want to, then knit through the chart a couple of times and measure it and see. And hopefully you wrote down what you had pre-blocking for the first square that we did together. So I am really dang close. So I think I'm going to go with it. I'm going to go with what I have here. I do have a couple of notes I want to share with you regarding the written instructions or the chart, depending on what you prefer to use. Also, I will link down below in the video description the helpful tips that Alison Green of Berroco recorded. Also, I'll link that video down below. Before we get started, I want to recognize another batch of patrons that have joined the Purl Together patron community in the last several weeks. Thanks so much to Chris, Kelly, Deb, Mimi, Stephanie, Deborah, Carol Lee, Catherine, Kimberly, Craig, Deborah, and Becky. Thanks so much for joining me. If you're interested in seeing what I'm offering for your small monthly pledge, head over to patreon.com/Purl Together and check out the incentives. It's pretty straightforward this week. Again, it's a knit and purl combination that creates a fantastic texture. All right, before we get into this too much, let's take a look at the chart. You're certainly welcome to follow the written instructions if you like, but I prefer knitting from a chart. And since we're knitting back and forth, on the right side of our work, which are in this case even numbered rows, we're gonna knit from right to left. We're reading the chart in the same way that we knit from right to left, and then you go up one row and then back the other way. And so this indicates down here on the key, the squares are knitting on the right side and purling on the wrong side, because when you turn your work over, it's the opposite. So just make sure you read the chart notes if you're new to this. But the reason I like to work from the chart is when you have particularly when you have the repeats in between the red lines are similar to the asterisks in the written pattern. So you'd knit 2, and then you're going to have purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, etc. And I count the purl bumps. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I know that after I purl the 5th time, then I'm at the end of my repeat, and there's one more knit, and then I'm at the end of the repeat. So I look for patterns like that, and I can tell that I'm gonna purl. I check the purl bumps, if that makes sense. So I just completed row 11, and now I'm going to row 12, and like Alison says in her video, I like to use, if I'm not using Knit Companion, I'm using paper, I put Post-it notes above the row that I'm on so that I can see how the stitches stack onto each other. So I know that when I come up to this first purl after I knit 3, that there will be a knit stitch right below it. So I'm going to knit 3, and then this is where I'm going to purl. There'll be a knit stitch right below, so I can tell that that's the case, and I can see how things build on each other because I can see all the rows below corresponding to my actual work. Hopefully that makes sense. By the way, if you overlap your Post-it notes like this, kind of like they're shingles, then you can peel them all up and move them as one unit. Just a little tip for you there. Okay, so I know that on this row, for example, I'm going to knit 3. Then the written instructions will say purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1. And you can certainly decipher that easily enough. Actually, the written instructions say knit 3, purl 1, knit 1 twice, and then purl 1 again. But when I just look at this, I know that I'm going to alternate purl 1, knit 1, and I'm going to do that 3 times, and I'll have 3 purl bumps. And after my 3rd purl bump, I know that I'm going to knit 3 in a row. So that's how I like using the chart rather than the written instructions, but you do what's easiest for you. Okay, after I've done that, I know that I have 3 knits in a row, and that's part of this diamond. So I also can double check them in the right spot because you can see that this is the center column of that diamond, and I have 3 knits right here, and then that's going to be a purl because I'm extending this pattern over to the right to cover more diamonds. So I'm going to have 3 knits in a row, and then the next time we do this, we're going to have 2. Or sorry, we're going to have 1. So it's just going to be symmetrical to what we had here, where we have 1 knit, then we have 3, then 5, then 7, and now we're going back down 5, 3, and 1. So if you can just follow along the pattern, you can tell whether you're on track or not, particularly if you line up these center columns. You can definitely tell if you've gotten off kilter somewhere. So my tip is just to look at the pattern and look for that symmetry and make sure that your work looks like the design, and you can tell that it certainly does. Okay, I'm going to get after finishing this. I hope you found this helpful. These tips about reading a chart. I'd love to see your blocks, your finished blocks. Tag me on Instagram at @purl_together. And absolutely show me a photo in the Facebook group and or the Ravelry group. Okay, I hope you're enjoying these first few blocks. Now, let me clarify what's going to happen in February. The pattern will be released, and it will be, if I'm understanding correctly, it will be a series of 6 blocks with different stripe sequences, and you can knit them all in February, or you can space them out throughout the year. I'll have to see how much time I have for video and editing. As you may know, I'm going to Tennessee the February 1st and 2nd, and I have classes that I'm offering there. So if you're anywhere in the Chattanooga area, I'd love to see you. I'll put a link down below so you can see what classes I'm teaching. All right, have a wonderful knitting weekend.